Hi there, folks. There is so much going on, it's hard to even know where to start. But let's start anyway. So we have, as we know, Israel sort of stuck in a holding pattern in this war, having evacuated Khan Yunis and most of Gaza. Indeed, the only unit that was left in Gaza until recently was the Nahal unit, which after 6 long months in Gaza has finally left and is being replaced by two reserve brigades, the 679 Yiftach Armored Brigade and the 2nd Carmeli Infantry Brigade. One member of the Nahal Brigade was quoted saying, "Thank goodness we're going out. We missed our mother's cooking." So thank you for your service, the brave men and women of the Nahal Brigade. But this is an untenable situation, obviously, because Hamas remains undefeated and the hostages remain unreleased. So recently, Israel has entered into some pretty intense negotiations with Egypt over two subjects. One subject we'll talk about a little bit later, that's the invasion of Rafah. The other topic, the possible ceasefire. And tomorrow, representatives from the Egyptian government are heading to Israel to discuss it, which is an exception. Usually, Israel goes to Cairo to discuss things. It shows that Egypt is trying to up its involvement. As we know, a lot of this has to do with their competition with Qatar over who will be the main um, mediators in the hostage deal or in a ceasefire deal. Israel definitely is leaning towards moving with Egypt, also hoping, and rightfully so, it seems, to link this with successful negotiations on the Rafah invasion. Egypt has its own pretty ambitious deal to end the war. Here are the details of that as um, covered by Israeli media. One, a long ceasefire and no entry into Rafah. The release of all the hostages over 10 weeks in exchange for Palestinian prisoners, of course, a declaration that a move towards a Palestinian state will begin, and that declaration will include and be endorsed by Israel, Egypt, the PA, and Jordan. Now, it's believed that Hamas would agree to this because it involves basically an end to the war. Hamas would like a permanent end to the war, but they may be willing to agree to a year-long ceasefire. Israel might be willing to agree to a year-long ceasefire, but they're certainly not going to be willing to agree to the Palestinian state part of this. So ultimately, this deal is a non-starter. The fact that Israel is willing to discuss it shows more about their desire to bring Egypt into the process than anything else. The rift between the US and Israel on one side and Qatar on the other, over the sense that Qatar hasn't been a faithful interlocutor and has not put pressure on Hamas, is significant. And that's also led to a rift between Hamas and Qatar, and there's a lot of talk about Hamas relocating to Turkey from Qatar, although I'll believe that when I see it. So Israel will be unlikely to accept this Egyptian proposal. Instead, it's considering a more minor deal for fewer humanitarian hostages. Now, you may remember Israel demanded 40 humanitarian hostages for a temporary ceasefire, and Hamas said it doesn't have 40 hostages available, hinting that there may be more dead than that, or that they at least can't locate more than that. Israeli intelligence believes that they're lying and that there are more humanitarian hostages alive than 20, but it appears that Hamas is unwilling to release all of them in exchange for a temporary ceasefire. They think that the fact that they floated a lower number may suggest they'd be willing to accept a temporary ceasefire for less hostages. Therefore, Israel is ready, according to reports today in Israeli media, to release fewer hostages, somewhere between 20 and 33, depending on who you believe. And in exchange for that, Israel would release not only prisoners, but also be willing to allow all Palestinians who are not Hamas to return to their homes in the north of the Strip. So that may be a deal that Hamas would be willing to consider since they'd be getting fewer hostages. Um, it's unclear. Hamas continues to insist that it's not willing to make a deal unless the war ends, but Israel hopes that by accepting fewer hostages, that can change. Meanwhile, uh, the operation in Rafah is still on the table. Israel's had a good deal of success in convincing Egypt and the USA to remove any barriers to it. So Ronen Bar, who's the head of the Shin Bet Shabak security agency, Herzi Halevi, the chief of staff, were reported to have traveled to Cairo to discuss the matter. And what they found is that the Egyptians are okay with it. Their main problem is that mass amounts of civilians would cross into Gaza. They're also worried that that would cause Hamas to start cooperating with terror organizations in Sinai. So if Israel can prevent that, and Israel believes that it can prevent that, Egypt is not expected to put up any major obstacles. Al-Sisi gave a speech today hinting at what he's for and what he's against. That's the Egyptian president. He said, quote, "The Egyptian position has been clear from day one. We reject any attempt to uproot Palestinians from their homes, into Egypt, or anywhere else." What he did not say is that he's against an operation in Rafah. Meanwhile, Amos Yadlin, former head of Amman, said today on Israeli news that, quote, "The U.S. has shut off its red light and now has a yellow one for the operation in Rafah. If the population is moved out, there will be a green light too." So we really see here that Israel has the opportunity to go into Rafah if it manages the population correctly without any diplomatic obstacles, at least from those two players. Now, one of the reasons that Hamas seems to be willing to toy with a ceasefire is because Israel has finally taken some steps to show that it's serious about going into Rafah. You may have seen that there have been satellite photos showing Israel building tent cities near Khan Yunis, building hundreds of tents, each one of which can contain 12 people, in order to facilitate the refugees that would move from Rafah north. About 250, 300,000 have already moved north, and that would facilitate the attack as well. Um, Remember, the attacks of Iran and the cooperation surrounding Iran have upgraded U.S. Israeli relations, and that has definitely facilitated these talks. An Israeli official told Israel Hayom that their preparations to invade Rafah are very serious. And he said, quote, "In the event of a prospect for a hostage deal, we will stop. But if it happens, there is no plan to delay what has been planned." Meanwhile, the United States has been putting diplomatic pressure on Hamas as well. Um, a statement was released by all the nations that had individuals among the hostages, calling on Hamas to accept the hostage deal and release the hostages. The reason this is a big deal is because the statement that they signed really puts the onus on Hamas to accept the ceasefire and not on Israel, because Israel has already agreed to the terms that the United States believes are reasonable. So the countries that signed it weren't just the United States, it was Argentina, Austria, Brazil, Britain, Bulgaria, Canada, Colombia, Denmark, France, Germany, Hungary, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Serbia, Spain, and Thailand. So a very good assortment of countries. Particularly difficult to get was Brazil, and it's a good thing that U.S. diplomacy managed to land them on it as well. But even though there's pressure on on Hamas right now, without it being clear that Israel's going to Rafah, and I would say without Israel really going into Rafah, the whole deal scenario is going nowhere. Sinwar has been insisting very consistently that he won't agree to a deal unless the fighting stops permanently. And that's why a lot of these reports have made no sense to me that a deal is coming near, and it's certainly no nearer now. Hamas has stated that mediation efforts will achieve nothing without that. What they are nervous about, and the reason that there's a little bit more give, especially in their answers through Egypt, is the Rafah operation. Also, possibly nervous about possibility that they'll be exiled from Qatar, Turkey. And that's probably one of the reasons that they released that video of hostage Hirsch Goldberg Polin, the individual who was taken hostage from the Nova party and whose arm was blown off and amputated in the battle. It was a way to remind Israel that an invasion into Rafah would put hostages like Hirsch in danger, which is certainly the truth. But if the mere preparations for an invasion make Hamas nervous, the actual operation would probably improve the negotiating position. So I think Israelis are aware that trying to make any deal before that is unlikely and not certain to be a good idea. However, on this channel, I often said in the past that if Israel invaded Rafah, that would be a way to defeat Hamas. Unfortunately, that's no longer really true, and I've discussed this too. Since Israel withdrew its forces from Khan Yunis and other areas, including Gaza City, Hamas has restored its capabilities throughout the Strip, including north of the divider, but in particular south of the divider, it's taken over Khan Yunis. It now has the ability to move brigades. There's four brigades in Rafah, the famous four brigades, to move them from Rafah to Khan Yunis. Most likely wouldn't move all of them, maybe would divide them between the two cities. And it certainly has already begun to move hostages out of Rafah and spread them throughout the Strip, which would be the smart thing to do. So if Israel goes into Rafah, it will not be able to eliminate Hamas control, which currently spans almost the entire Gaza Strip. There are military reasons to go in there. There's tunnels to be found there, especially those leading in from Egypt. And if Israel goes into Rafah, takes over the Philadelphia corridor, and then organizes better security there with their Egyptian security partners, that would be worth the invasion on its own. But make no mistake, that would not, by any means, finish off Hamas and the war. So it looks to me, and I've talked to some sources in the IDF, like the goal of the war right now has changed. If the Philadelphia corridor is taken, the IDF will focus on creating a better security perimeter there and want to stay there. It's not clear if the government will allow the IDF to stay there, but they certainly want to. And with it looking increasingly unlikely that Israel is going to defeat Hamas, goal will likely be to leave a weakened Hamas in the Gaza Strip and cut off its supply to the rest of the world, thereby removing a lot of the danger that Hamas presents to Israel. Um, it doesn't appear to IDF commanders that I've talked to that the government is going to go through with what is needed in order to destroy Hamas, which would be, of course, step one, take over the entire Gaza Strip. Take two, install a new government to replace Hamas. If that political will is lacking, the new goal will be to contain Hamas as weak as possible inside Gaza and control the borders. I think it's a terrible mistake. Hamas will find new ways to strengthen itself. Hamas will find new ways to threaten Israeli security. And Hamas will enjoy a victory over Israel that may allow it to strengthen its presence in the West Bank and eventually overthrow the Palestinian Authority, thus strengthening Iran's stranglehold on the region. So I think this is a terrible mistake. Having said that, weakening Hamas is better than not weakening Hamas. And that appears to be, unfortunately, from my perspective, the new goal of the entire operation in Gaza. So I have some questions from you. Most of them are from back when the attack on Iran was the major issue on our minds. It's amazing how things change in the Middle East. But here are the questions. Vanilovan asks, what picture of the underground war do we have 6 months in? What percentage of Hamas has survived because it's underground in Rafah? Does the IDF have any estimates of how much of the network has remained and what utility Hamas can still extract from them? Okay, so one of the problems with the estimates of how many tunnels still exist and how many tunnels have been destroyed is that the IDF doesn't really know how many tunnels still exist and have how many have been destroyed, because if it knew about tunnels, it would go in and destroy them. So what we tend to have is an idea of overestimation of how much of the tunnel network has been destroyed. And the best evidence of that is the fact that Hamas has been able to move people, weapons, hostages in and out through the tunnels into Gaza City, even after the south of the Strip was taken, and Israeli intelligence is aware of that. So my guess is that most of the tunnel network and that Hamas is able to get from most places to other places, and that some of the parts of the tunnel network that have been harmed or seem destroyed have been rebuilt. I'm sure the tunnel network has seen better days because the IDF has put in a lot of effort, but a lot of the secret measures that it had, the idea of flooding the tunnels and other things like that, have been underwhelming in their success. How much of Hamas has survived? That's also a matter of controversy. I don't think that when Israel actually destroys a brigade, in the sense that the brigade no longer works as a brigade, that means that all of the um, terrorists in those units are out of commission. My guess is at least 25% of them are able to fight on. And then we have six brigades, it appears, because you have four in Rafa, two in the central camps that remain within their original structures. So my guess would be that about half, unfortunately, of Hamas remains. There have been new recruits in the meantime. I think Hamas is doing a lot better than we think it is. And the reason being, the IDF has taken the pressure off at a crucial time. Mike 990 asks, based on how easily Israel's presumably F-35s penetrated Iranian airspace, how would Tehran even hope to conduct a conventional war against Israel? Do you think there's any chance of that happening? Well, that's a good question, Mike. I mean, ultimately, a conventional war to me implies you have a border between you, and you fight it out, or you land a bunch of troops in a foreign country and fight it out that way. Either France versus Germany in World War One, for example, or the U.S. versus Iraq in the Gulf War. Neither of those things is going to happen because neither Israel nor Iran has the capability nor the desire, most likely, to send their ground troops into the other country. So instead, you would have an attempt from both countries to hurt the other one as much as possible. Now, it's true that Israel has escalation dominance in terms of its technology. And the F-35s are a good example of that. It has the ability to shoot down rockets that the Iranians don't have or have less of an ability to do. But what Iran has that Israel doesn't have is a network of proxies on Israel's border that can cause a ton of damage. Just look at the difference between what the drones that were and missiles flying from Iran did versus when the next day Hezbollah shot drones at Israeli military and injured a whole bunch of soldiers, causing way more damage than Iran could because they're close, because they know Israel and its weaknesses so well. The Iranian proxies can damage Israel terribly. So what ends up happening, if there's a war, quote unquote, between Israel and Iran, is that both sides just hurt each other repeatedly through various means. Each one has its advantages. No one really wins. There's just a lot of suffering and misery. And that is exactly the reason that both Israel and Iran avoided an escalation, because there's really not much in it for either side. It's better for Israel to finish off fighting proxies like Hamas, and it's better for Iran to use proxies to attack Israel like they're doing. Sunny Laboof asks, while the downfall of the Islamic Republic is of course desirable, I'm skeptical about whether such a thing can be achieved even with the help of the coalition of which you speak. Surely it would require an invasion and occupation of Iran, something that might not even be feasible and would cause more problems than it solves. In your view, what would a serious attempt by an international coalition to unseat the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran look like? Oh, that's a good question. Okay, so I think that a real attempt would have to involve close coordination with Iranian opposition both inside the country and abroad. It would have to involve a massive decapitation strike against the leadership of Iran. It would have to involve cybernetic attack that would incapacitate communications in Iran. It would have to involve massive bombing by the coalition of Iranian Islamic Republic infrastructure and the CIA, Mossad, and other intelligence organizations would have to put in motion this overthrow of the regime. I think the less ground troops you use in this, the better, since that would uh, put off and rally a lot of people to the flag of the Islamic Republic. Is this possible? That's a very good question. The more resources you put into this, the more likely it is to succeed. But we're talking about an investment and an attack on a level of sophistication and coordination that we haven't seen yet in the Middle East. I think it is possible on a military operational level. Is it possible on a diplomatic level? That's a whole other question. There's a lot of political constraints right now stopping that. Okay, so that's our episode for today. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon at Trail Media and listening to my history podcast. I will be here again very